Remember, however, is that from now on, I suspect, over the next 10 years or more, Eisenhower's mantra at the top, where he talks about the criticality of security and solvency and having both, will be adhered to. It's going to be a struggle, but we're going to get there. I don't have any solutions to the economic problem, and I'm not up here to tell you what should be cut and how we cut things, although occasionally I do talk about economics because remember Galbraith's famous observation about economics and economists in general. They exist to make astrologers look professional. He's right. So, you know, pick your economist and you can get whatever answer you'd like. From my vantage point, it's obvious we're going to have to reduce spending. How we do it, when we do it, that's another matter, but it's coming. It's unavoidable. That's part of the wave that Bill Gates mentioned. How do we surf this wave as it comes headed straight for us? And by us, I mean the U.S. Armed Forces and the Army. Next slide. The new Secretary of Defense. Everybody wants to know, what's the story on Panetta? What's he really think? What's he going to do? And Panetta is one of the most savvy politicians that probably anyone has seen in Washington for at least 35 or 40 years, and he's not saying much. And I don't expect him to say much, but he is planning, and his inner circle is planning. And they are looking carefully at the armed forces, at what they can or cannot cut easily or quickly, and then they are looking at the long-term implications. This is not a man who's simply going to take an axe to the budget. At least that's not his preference. He wants to make cuts in a way that rationalizes the forces for the future. He really does. He understands that repaving old roads, rebuilding old structures, rebuilding old forces, continuing to turn out old ship designs for the surface fleet, continuing to do the things that we have done for many, many decades is not the answer for the future. And that's what he's looking at. Where will he go? How far will he go? When will he go? I think we're not going to see dramatic change until after the next presidential election. And at that point, I would argue it doesn't make any difference who wins the election. You're going to see profound change in the defense establishment and spending for it. But in general, I think he's going to focus on streamlining, simplifying, and unifying. People are now talking for the first time that I can remember in the last 25 or 30 years about the quote-unquote overhead in the armed forces. People are finally talking about it. I had a conversation the other day with someone I can't mention who is very highly placed, but when I said we don't need a repetition of what happened in 1991, he understood immediately. He said, you mean we can't afford to throw 163,000 experienced soldiers out of the Army and keep all the generals and all the headquarters? I said, exactly. But again, I wouldn't expect anything profound to go on until after the next election, but at that point, I would expect things to happen. So he'll want to streamline the command structures. He's going to look at the regional unified commands because we can't afford them all. By the way, we don't need them all. And that's another aspect of his analysis. And then finally, this business of unification, which I will talk about in the rest of the briefing here, is not about creating one service with one uniform. Although if I were in the Army right now, I'd happily give up the one you got. Go to something else. Thank God I haven't had to wear that thing. But I like the Marine uniforms, you know, they appeal to me. But the Army uniforms do not. I don't know what Schoonmaker was thinking when he did that. Anyway, the point is, integration involves integration of capabilities across service lines. That's different from unifying and turning yourself into a sort of Canadian thing. That's not what this is about. It's about developing command structures that allow you to reach across those service lines and to reduce the numbers of chains of command, reduce the numbers of headquarters overhead. And that, of course, gets to the single service warfighting structures which dominate the entire U.S. defense establishment. Now, I don't know how far he'll go. I have my views, but I think he's going to look at those things, and that's why I put it up here. So you might just want to tuck that away and just think in terms of streamline, simplify, and unify, with an emphasis on teeth and keeping teeth as opposed to the massive overhead, not a repetition of 1991. Next slide. Now, this is enormously important. These are the questions that are not, I frame them here for the Army generals, for the Army 4-stars. But these are questions that everyone in the United States Armed Forces ultimately has to deal with. And these are the questions that no one really wants to answer. And if they do answer them, the answer is, why, what we're doing right now is fine. There's no reason to change. Everything is fine. Look, we have been successful everywhere for 50 years, haven't we? Why change? I remember Michael O'Hanlon. You've all seen him on television. He was one of the most severe critics that I had to confront when Breaking the Phalanx was published, because his statement was, well, MacGregor's written an interesting book, but you know, the burden is on him to prove that anything should change in the Army after the Titanic victory over the Iraqis in '91. Of course, my own view of the Titanic victory over the Iraqis is we could have done it with 50,000 men in a week and been much more successful and much more effective, but we had this inflated view of our enemy, and we tended to walk away from that experience with an inflated view of ourselves. But nonetheless, that was the O'Hanlon response, and that has been the status quo response inside the Defense Committee in Washington for a long time. First, you have to look at the current strategic environment, be realistic about it. Don't see it through an ideological lens. Stop thinking in terms of, well, we have to rush to Libya to save people who are allegedly on the verge of being slaughtered by their evil dictator. That kind of thing is just not affordable for the future, and it's largely unnecessary, I would argue. And I would also argue, based on my experience with the Kosovo air campaign, it's a blatant lie. Saddam, our friend in Libya, the crazy man, Muammar Gaddafi, was not preparing to slaughter thousands of people. It's just utterly false, just as there was no evidence before we started bombing in Kosovo that the Yugoslav army was going to go and slaughter thousands and thousands of Albanians either. But these things were said to stiffen support, build support, mobilize support for actions that the American people under normal circumstances would never take. We've got to look at that environment realistically. I think if you look at it, you can escape the conclusion that today, and certainly for the next 10 years, maybe longer, there is no existential military threat to the United States. That doesn't mean there aren't any threats, but there is no existential military threat to the United States. Once you've decided what that strategic environment looks like, then you want to create a new operational concept. And I'm not talking about this laundry list on the Joint Staff of 95 joint operational concepts, which are ridiculous. I'm talking about this issue of integration. Looking at the capabilities that are there, how do you integrate them? How do you maximize them? How do you get the most for your money when you invest? You know, right now we pay more than anyone else in the world for what we get. I mean, it's just astonishing. And the other thing is that integration, when you start to integrate capabilities, you also save a lot of money. But it's very threatening to the status quo. But that's where the joint operational or new operational concept needs to go. Third, within the fiscal means available. That's very important. Some of you who have a background in the Navy, I'm sure there have got to be some token members of the naval forces here besides Scotty over here. I'm sure there are. Are there not? Do we have some naval officers here? Okay, I know Cameron is. Go back and look at Jackie Fisher, the former First Sea Lord, or actually he was the equivalent of the Chief of Naval Operations in the early 1900s. He suddenly confronted a new strategic environment. From 1815 until 1900, the Royal Navy spent most of its time doing what? Policing the empire, chasing pirates, ending slavery, escorting troop transports, but there was no fleet to fight, per se. No potential existential threat. It was quite clear in the late 1890s with the buildup of the German Imperial Navy that that was changing. And so when he was appointed, he recognized that he needed a new Navy. And his first act was not to ask for more money. He did not ask for more money. He was offered more money, and he didn't take it. Instead, he retired 254 vessels because he said they were of no longer any use to the Royal Navy. He took the savings, and he also retired some officers, as is inevitably the case. And he put those savings into a new shipbuilding program that culminated with the sort of dreadnought classes and the battle cruisers and so forth. The fleet that shows up at Jutland and that ultimately runs the blockade around Europe and contains the German fleet for 4 years is Jackie Fisher's fleet. He started building it in 1899. But that's because Fisher looked at the real strategic environment and he was willing to take some risk. If you don't think people were upset by the sudden disappearance of flotillas of gunboats from across the British Empire, you're wrong. There was an outcry. You're putting the empire at risk. And Winston Churchill, who became the first Sea Lord and put Jackie Fisher to work to do these kinds of things, made a very important statement. And it's one that we should burn into our memories from a strategic standpoint. He said, if we lose the main theater, but we save Egypt, we're lost. On the other hand, if we win the main event in the main theater, which then had become the North Sea and the North Atlantic, we can always recover Egypt. And he was right. And so the British focus shifted dramatically away from the imperial policing to what was really the new event of strategic criticality to Great Britain. And remember that in 1900, there was no threat of an existential type whatsoever to the British Empire. The only real threat they faced until about 1912 was the possibility of Russian invasion through Afghanistan into northern India. And that's what they were focused on. That receded into the background rather quickly, though, as it became clear that Germany was becoming the leading military state in the world. So my point is, you've got to get these things right, and you have to stop thinking in terms of, we want more money, and instead think in terms of, what are we going to cast off? What are we going to divest ourselves of to extract the savings we need so that we, as an army and as an armed force, can be in 10 years what we need to be to confront what could be a very different strategic environment from today's. Next slide. Next slide. Now, what's changed? This is a very contentious discussion, and it's one that you should engage in. And I can't get it all on one slide, but you need to think about it. I was always stunned, really from 2003 onward, when I would listen to people talk about, well, we've got to mobilize the nation. We've got to mobilize the nation to fight in Iraq. Iraq? If you add the gross national products of all the Arab countries together, they don't equal the output of the Netherlands. You don't mobilize for that kind of thing. You know, we can't reverse the stupid decisions to dismantle the government, dismantle the military, and create the insurgency against us. But the point is, we're not going to mobilize. We're not going to mobilize because warfare has changed and because we need the best and the brightest minds inside the scientific industrial establishment to build the technology we need to defend ourselves. That is more important now than ever before. The second one, Iraq's occupation. There's been a lot of discussion about counterinsurgency. Privately, I've never been a fan, and I regard most of it as tragic, unfortunate, ill-conceived, and should be avoided at all costs. And I was always a pariah when I would make these statements. Today, everybody on the Hill agrees with me. Doesn't matter, Democrat or Republican, everybody does. Why? It's unaffordable. It costs too much money. It demands too much manpower. And here's the worst piece of news. There's absolutely no guarantee after you've done all of those things that the strategic outcome for the United States will be positive. In Iraq, it's a disaster. It is a catastrophe. Regionally today, all of the Sunni Arab states are furious with us because we've established something that hasn't existed for 1,000 years, a Shiite, Islamist, Arab state. And it's like installing cancer in somebody as far as they're concerned. So the point is that reversible? Well, I suppose you could reverse it if you're willing to kill another 250,000 people. I don't see much evidence that anybody's interested in that. But my point is that's not the kind of outcome we want. We're looking at a similar outcome in Afghanistan. And I think we have to come to terms with an important strategic reality. The people that live in the region are always going to hold the trump cards vis-a-vis the United States. They live there. They border Iraq. They border Afghanistan. They will be there when we're gone.